Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, articles, research your notes, and find the most important insights for you.
That's right. We're here to guide you through the material, helping you understand what's most important and uncover some surprising details along the way.
Today, we're undertaking a deep dive into the history of Kuwait. We've got this collection of articles and research here, and our mission is really to unpack the stack of knowledge, bring you the key facts, the surprising bits about Kuwait's unique journey.
Hmm.
We want to try and step beyond maybe the conventional Western perspectives and really understand this small but, strategically vital state right there at the tip of the Persian Gulf.
It really is a fascinating story, shaped by, well, everything from its challenging geography and its deep past to global trade, major conflicts, that incredibly rapid modernization, and this ongoing resilience you see.
So where does the story even begin? I mean, the sources paint this really vivid, almost poetic picture of the very, very early days, long before the modern state we know.
They really do. One source describes the land initially as, well, unremarkable, even an inhospitable land bordering what it calls torrential seas. Quite dramatic.
Yeah.
It talks about the arrival centuries ago of these, what it calls intrusive, insatiable marauders, basically people looking for trade routes and, places to hide their plunder.
Finding early towns built of stone and timber, probably easy targets, right? So they needed safer spots.
Exactly. Pirates were apparently drawn to these humble settlements, brackish water wells, dwarf evergreen shrubs, not exactly inviting. Various groups drifted in, and eventually newcomers got a stronger grip.
Yeah.
Though the source does say this pirate period, it doesn't actually occupy that many pages in its account.
Right, just a phase. But life wasn't destined to stay monotonous, it seems, under what the source calls the most regal dynasty. Differences in status, wealth, power. They were there, but apparently not seen as intolerable. Actually generated elation and enthusiasm, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's a curious framing. As affluence grew, the wealthy started investing in solid objects of pride, visible wealth. Others looked for places to put their capital, and architects started transforming these sometimes higgledy-piggledy towns into neat and gay places of everlasting interest, hustle and bustle.
Wow. Neat and gay places. Okay.
Yeah.
Embellished with things like domes and minarets laid at the feet of the young and fickle goddess of architecture, as the source puts it metaphorically.
It's quite an image, isn't it? It paints this picture of transformation, hinting at that resilience and aspiration right from the start. And so much of that story, it's rooted in the geography itself.
Yeah, that's definitely where our stack of sources really starts to unpack things. Geography is just so crucial for understanding Kuwait.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here is its unique position, right? It's where the huge Arabian Peninsula desert meets the western edge of the Iranian plateau. A real crossroads.
And its borders. They tell such a long, complex story. One source gets really specific about the agreements.
It does. It mentions a border with Iraq set up by markers from agreements going back to 1922, then modified in 27, apparently to manage nomadic movement, which makes sense. And a northern section agreed in 1923.
Then there's the border going south to the Gulf.
Yeah, that was part of an 1899 treaty. And marking these borders, demarcation, it's been this ongoing effort. Commissions formed in 1960, detailed physical marking with Saudi Arabia in 66 and 69, involving engineers from 3 different countries.
Wow.
And the source notes the repercussions are still felt today. There are ongoing committees, engineers still managing these boundaries. It's not just lines on a map.
No, clearly not. And the physical landscape itself is also pretty distinctive. Mostly flat desert, gravel plains.
Yeah, very flat. There's only one low group of hills, just 110 meters high, barely rising 12 meters above the desert around it. The highest point in the whole country is only about 300 feet above sea level.
But the coast is different, you said.
Yes, exactly. A significant stretch bordering the Gulf, and it's described as dropping quite sharply to the water. So you have this combination. Strategic coastal location, great for trade routes, but then this really unforgiving inland climate. Very few natural resources historically.
That must have really shaped the people, their values.
Profoundly. It pushed them toward adaptability, innovation, and developing this really sharp, commercial sense. It forced them outwards towards the sea, towards trade, rather than just relying on the land.
That environmental pressure,
Yeah,
it connects directly to those echoes of the past you find in the early settlements, right?
absolutely. Near the Iraqi border, you have sites like Al Qurayn and Al Naqaila revealing this really deep history. Yeah. French and Kuwaiti teams were excavating there in the early 90s after a big discovery in 1988.
Near a military airbase, of all places.
Yeah, it's surprising. They found this large sand mound, turned out to be one of the most extensive archaeological sites in the whole state, basically burial mounds.
Burial mounds.
And the really remarkable thing is, the process of building these mounds started over 7,000 years ago, and it continued for millennia. Just incredible continuity.
Well, what did they actually find in the digs?
Well, in one mound, which had layers spanning from roughly 7,800 down to about 6,200 years ago, they found 76 human burials.
Wow.
And alongside them, pottery, stone vessels, funerary objects. Some pottery was identified specifically as Halaf culture, dating back maybe 5,000, 5,300 years. They also found over 10,000 chipped flint pieces, carved stone objects. It shows significant human activity, tool making, over a really long time.
And what about the second mound they mentioned?
That one's a bit weird. Apparently it just contained rocks. No human burials, no artifacts, though there was some pottery nearby suggesting the Halaf period again. Bit of a mystery, that one.
The sources also mention even earlier finds, don't they?
They do. Remains of early Bronze Age architecture found near Al Quran, dating to about 4,900 years ago. Pottery fragments mostly. Other finds were more, everyday stone artifacts.
So these sites, even though it's just a small fraction of the heritage uncovered so far, they really deepen our understanding of who was living there earliest.
Definitely. They show this continuous human presence, this adaptation in a tough environment over millennia. It really hints at the roots of that resilience we see again and again in Kuwait's history.
And that resilience was definitely needed as Kuwait City started to rise as this maritime hub.
Exactly. By the 18th century, Kuwait emerges as this essential maritime trade center, key for Persian Gulf merchants, a vital stop for European ships heading to India.
So the city's growth was just directly linked to trade and shipping expanding.
Completely. The sources highlight the pearl industry, which was very lucrative, and building larger dhows, those traditional sailing ships, to support it all.
And this fueled the local economy, established this powerful merchant class.
Yeah, and their success wasn't just luck. It was intelligence, boldness, connections to officials, and this really critical network of what the source calls small associates. Basically, trusted middlemen, agents, facilitating these huge trading operations.
But growth brings problems.
Always. The sources mention difficulty finding enough manpower. Healthy men is the phrase used to meet the demand from all the trade and shipping, even with people moving into the area. They needed a more lasting increase of manpower.
There's also that kind of telling detail about foreign inhabitants around the time some key legal documents were formalized.
Yes, that bit. The source says after these framing documents were done, probably agreements solidifying authority or property rights, almost all the foreign residents left, either voluntarily or under duress.
Under duress.
Some took goods or boats, others left nothing. The source says quite starkly that the fear of death or dispossession alone was sufficient to calm the neighborhood. It suggests pretty firm, maybe even harsh measures were used to consolidate control.
Yet at the same time, other things were reinforcing opportunities there. Kuwait's authority over its surrounding territory, the hinterland, was recognized. Safety on vital trade routes, like connecting Oman to Indian markets, was guaranteed.
And the source mentions the Bedouins' honest dealings with merchants, which made trading through Kuwait even more appealing. This is described as the result of Kuwait's national migration, suggesting people were actively drawn to these growing opportunities.
So this period sees the coasts of the Gulf and the mouth of the Tigris River becoming these sort of beacons of civilization connected way back to the Far East.
Right. And meanwhile, European powers are sniffing around, searching for the new world, new markets for Eastern spices, trying to burrow into the depths of these lands, as the source puts it.
It even notes that the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, were already dealing with Indian Ocean traders before the Europeans showed up.
Yeah, puts in perspective. The source gives some specific, almost snapshot-like details of this Arabian trade world, too.
Like what?
It mentions traders using coastal embankments, the arrival of ships called dakalis with captains. Pearls are described quite vividly, exchanged for chalcedony. The Kalb tribe is linked to the pearl trade. Timber is mentioned, though apparently treated with less patience than other goods, maybe because it was bulky or less valuable.
Maybe.
And it mentions small, scattered islands being a royal reserve.
Hmm.
These details, they're sometimes a bit sparse on context, but they paint this picture of a really complex, valuable, established trading system already in place.
Okay, so Kuwait City is becoming this essential hub. How did its role fit into the bigger picture, the wider Persian Gulf trade network?
Well, looking at the whole Gulf, it's relatively narrow, but obviously a vital waterway, touching 8 country shores.
Mm.
Bahrain was often seen as a central point, historically.
Right.
But the sources argue strongly that from around 1760, Kuwaiti shipping, carrying emissions, trade goods, it became dominant across this huge area, from the Tigris and Euphrates hinterland in the west, all the way east to China and the Spice Islands.
That's an incredible reach for what was still a relatively small state.
It really is. The source gives specific examples. Kuwaiti vessels with Persian silk near Shiraz way back in 1712. A Basra merchant ship taking refuge in Guera, a Kuwaiti port on the Saudi coast, in 1776.
And it describes Kuwait basically controlling the most widely netted and far-reaching anchorage in the Gulf, crowded with ships, mostly Kuwaiti, sailing from Singapore to the Mediterranean.
Yeah, it contrasts this with the decline of Basra, which had been the top commercial city for centuries, and mentions a sort of gloom-shrouding Qamran, another old port. It even mentions the shaping of the salt marsh and creeks near Ras Al Arab in this context.
And crucially,
Crucially, the source asserts that trade in the whole Mesopotamian region flourished so long as Kuwait was independently governed. That independence was clearly seen as absolutely key to its commercial success.
and this growing maritime power, inevitably, it attracted the attention of European powers, especially the British.
Yeah, that influx of Europeans from the 17th century onwards brought major geopolitical upheaval. The British, with their booming economy, colonial ambitions focused on India, they saw the Gulf's strategic location on that India route as vital.
By the 19th century, they'd secured footholds elsewhere, Muscat, Bahrain, and then they turned their attention to Kuwait, viewing it as a key commercial hub, but also, interestingly, a reputed pirate haven.
Right, which seems a bit contradictory, maybe. But Kuwait's geography, that safe harbor away from known pirate coasts, was actually an advantage. The Ottomans technically controlled the wider area, but they struggled to stamp out piracy.
So the British stepped in.
British intervention, yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly an 1839 pact aimed at ending maritime hostilities that paved the way for their growing influence. And it enabled what the source calls shenanigans against rivals and foes like the Wahhabis, using anti-piracy as a bit of a wedge, perhaps.
And their approach to Kuwait was different, described as more subdued and indirect compared to Muscat or Bahrain.
It was, initially. But then rising Anglo-American competition in the early 19th century, especially after a survey expedition, it spurred these intense negotiations about establishing British influence. Despite Ottoman and local opposition, Kuwait showed its diplomatic acumen by mediating various deals. They were clearly skilled navigators of these pressures.
Then came the British commercial consuls.
From 1850,
Yeah.
sent from Bombay, supposedly just to protect British subjects, but they gradually established more of a diplomatic presence through formal treaties.
Which led directly to that pivotal 1899 treaty.
Correct. That treaty effectively placed Kuwait within the British sphere of influence globally, formalized diplomatic relations. And with that external backing, Sheikh Mubarak al-Sabah was able to increasingly assert independence internally. He set up a police force, new courts for internal dissent.
This growing autonomy, though, was really tested during World War I.
Definitely. Turkey enters WWI on Germany's side October 1914. Just a week later, November 5th, the British declare a protectorate over Kuwait. They also allied with the Sharif of Mecca and Arab rebels against the Ottomans.
But initially, the British position in the Arabian Peninsula wasn't actually that strong, was it?
No, it was a really challenging landscape for them. A desert, complex, tribal politics. They hadn't built deep influence there yet. But remarkably, they gained control of most of the peninsula within just 2 years, apart from some southern islands and a bit of the northwest,
Oh.
primarily by skillfully exploiting tribal rivalries, using quite limited military force. Divide and rule, essentially.
Meanwhile, the eastern shore around Al-Kuwait itself held significant economic importance.
Oh, hugely. It was wealthier, more populous, more productive, a key transshipment port for trade from Al-Hassa and Al-Assa. And right up to 1916, its port services had very little foreign involvement, so profits from shipping were accumulating locally.
And the British recognized its strategic value even before oil was discovered there.
Absolutely. They were keenly aware of its location for protecting their wider oil interests elsewhere in the region. The idea of actually occupying al-Kuwait came up at a conference in Cairo, November 1914. They talked about maybe cooperating with Muscat, or the Sharif of Mecca, and seeking more overt control over Kuwait's foreign policy.
But there were doubts about that plan initially.
There were concerns about the cost, especially without guaranteed local oil revenue, compared to the interest in the nearby Al-Hasa coast. Fears of a venomous Syrian peril, probably meaning worries about nationalist or anti-colonial ideas spreading from the Levant, and just military doubts about defending the open anchorage.
So why did they go ahead with the protectorate then?
Ultimately, those doubts were outweighed by al-Kuwait's recognized strategic importance and its status as a burgeoning rival to the trade of Mesopotamia, the potential threat it posed, if not controlled, perhaps. So a plan was formalized. By January 1915, a British officer is presenting proposals to the Sheikh.
What kind of proposals?
Things like retaining the right to intervene militarily, allowing British naval visits, and even a requirement for the Sheikh to employ people from Bombay on local boats and lighters, really asserting influence.
Okay, so all of this history, the trade, the British influence, it really sets the stage for the single most transformative event in Kuwait's modern history, the discovery of oil.
Absolutely. The history of modern Kuwait is, as the sources clearly state, inextricably linked to discovering oil and setting up the Kuwait Oil Company, KOC, in 1934.
But there was an earlier attempt at finding oil, wasn't there?
Yes, Sheikh Mubarak al-Sabah granted a concession to a British company way back in 1899. But critically, they found no onshore oil, so interest just faded.
Until when?
Until that Anglo-American competition over oil heated up in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
That brought attention back to Kuwait. The British government actually pressured Gulf Oil Co. to pursue opportunities, leading to a concession with Sheikh Salim. But again, no significant results initially. There were also tensions over oil concessions rising in 1932.
Then there's that 1943 Mutual Defense Agreement, a shift in British strategy.
It seems so. Under that agreement, Hutchinson agreed with Gulf Oil to basically just store oil from 4 Kuwaiti wells during World War II. So significant exploration was paused during the conflict.
And after the war?
A KOC contract in March 1945 was more focused on pipelines, interestingly, designed to export Iraqi and Iranian oil through Kuwait, with Kuwait getting 50% of the profits. But the source mentions a $20 million cost for extensions that was apparently never repaid. Kuwait also played a role, a notable one, in the Suez Crisis.
A decisive one, yeah. Kuwait very pointedly refused to join the Egypt-led Federation of Arab States, which was formed partly to counter British and French influence during that crisis. Showed independence.
And the oil production really took off after the war.
Oh, massively. By the end of 1959, Kuwait was already the 7th in the world's oil-producing countries. Incredible rise. But that rapid wealth brought challenges too. The sources mention Kuwaiti inflation in 1958, causing a budget deficit and spreading economic strain. The sources also include that rather peculiar detail about exhibits after 1954. Microscopic watches.
Yes, it's a strange one. It says after 1954, 2 microscopic watches that the Kuwaitis had successively exploded, urns with the dessert in them, began to be exhibited. Honestly, the specific meaning is pretty opaque in the source material we have, but it's included as a noted event from that time, maybe just reflecting the sudden wealth leading to some unique or eccentric displays. Hard to say.
Definitely odd. And skirmishes in 1956 are noted as leading to more negotiations.
Right. But what's really striking is how quickly this oil wealth just triggered this comprehensive transformation, leading to that economic boom and modernity in the mid-20th century.
The source vividly describes the post-WWII oil boom, especially after finding the huge Bergen field in 1949, as transforming Kuwait from, well, it says an agricultural town.
Which we know is more of a maritime center, really.
Right, into a cosmopolitan city.
Yeah, and this boom, combined with political stability, control over the oil, and that strategic location, it created what the source calls a perfect environment for rigging a nation-state. The oil economy just grew at this breathtaking rate, establishing Kuwait really quickly as a significant actor in global politics.
There's that telling anecdote about the first government-sponsored students sent to England in 1951.
Ah, yes. They came back with a clear message. Kuwait must catch up with the West. And that ambition just fueled this incredibly rapid transition, described as going from a backward town to a modern state in less than half a century. Astonishing.
The compulsory education decree in 1959 is highlighted too, signaling this dramatic renovation of society.
And joining OPEC in 1960 gave them a way to control and stabilize oil prices and income. That meant generous state budgets, rising living standards, ambitious social programs, especially education schools, were filling up rapidly.
And the state periodically, distributed wealth directly to citizens, held lavish public ceremonies.
But while the wealth poured in, the sources do note that the way services were distributed, quite centrally, it limited broader economic redistribution. And significant business interests stayed largely in Anglo-American hands.
There's also an observation about the kind of economy being built.
Yeah, the sources suggest it became apparent that this controlled, managed economy, with what's called diminishing bureaucracy, maybe less independent oversight, it risked becoming this monstrous and ungainly entity, potentially inefficient, prone to problems down the line.
And all this economic power really set the stage for Kuwait achieving full sovereignty in 1961.
Exactly. June 19, 1961, the British treaty was formally ended. Kuwait's sovereignty unequivocally recognized, a huge moment.
And the sources emphasized the great urgency and efficiency with which they undertook internal reforms to get ready for these new responsibilities.
Yeah, July 61, a new law on the Emiri Diwan, that's the Emir's office, provided a framework to boost the ruling family's role in shaping new institutions and better defining the roles of the cabinet versus the legislative council.
A new constitution was drafted, drawing on an intensive study of constitutions from around the world with outside experts helping.
Right, and a law for the legislative council led to elections in January 63, setting up electoral districts. The cabinet ministries expanded hugely. Foreign affairs, commerce, and industry, an upgraded education ministry, public transport, a new health ministry with a proposed medical department, a new municipality law, building the state apparatus.
Plus a new 5-year plan for schools, bringing in technical help and consultants for designing institutions, infrastructure, sending students abroad on scholarships, too.
And public works just flourished. New international airport, huge road networks, sewage system, irrigation for parks, massive infrastructure improvements across the board.
But the source calls the most important aspect of independence paradoxical. Why?
Because it was the dramatic increase in the coffers of the government due to the extraordinary increase in oil revenues. Independence happened to coincide with this major upswing in oil income, which gave them the financial muscle for all this rapid development. Good timing, you could say.
Definitely. The new petroleum concessions law was discussed, endorsed by the National Assembly, and the National Petroleum Company was set up, signaling the new state taking control of its key resource.
And various international organizations were also willing to help Kuwait's development efforts, which shows its new standing on the world stage.
But this newly wealthy, independent state then faced its most severe crisis, the Gulf War.
Yeah, the Gulf War. August 2nd, 1990 to February 28th, 1991. A 34-nation U.S.-led coalition responding to Iraq's invasion and annexation of Kuwait on August 2nd.
Operation Desert Storm, known for deploying all that advanced military tech, laser bombs, UAVs, satellite TV feeds, smart weapons.
The timeline was incredibly swift and brutal. Invasion August 2nd, 1990. UN sanctions immediately. A withdrawal deadline set for January 15th, 91. Iraq doesn't comply. Airstrikes begin January 17th, followed by ground attacks, then a major ground assault routed the Iraqi military by February 24th. Kuwait liberated February 26th. Ceasefire ordered February 28th.
Saddam Hussein's invasion just shocked the Arab world, caused widespread fear, especially in Saudi Arabia next door, and global worries about the world's oil supply.
There was hope the UN could prevent war, and they acted fast with the trade embargo and authorizing force if needed. The scale of the coalition deployment was just immense, around 700,000 troops, mostly U.S.
Initially, there was a media blackout in Kuwait, wasn't there? Made it hard to know what was happening.
Right. But reports on January 17th confirmed the coalition's intense bombing campaign, targeting Iraqi military, oil, broadcast command infrastructure. The Iraqi military presence was quickly knocked out in that initial air phase, over 1,000 sorties a day. Heavy damage inside Iraq, over 1,000 Iraqi deaths estimated early on. Iraqi large-scale war capability was weakened, but thousands of troops still remained in Kuwait initially.
And after the liberation, the huge task of post-war reconstruction began.
The very first priority was just getting the population back quickly and safely. In July 91, Sheikh Jabir announced a national reconciliation committee to try and heal divisions, plus a fund for related programs.
And the government emphasized nurturing the democratic system, making it clear citizens had a role in lawmaking.
The National Assembly, elected summer 92, ratified UN-supervised laws, and formalized the reconstruction plans.
The sources really highlight a major focus on the banking sector during this time.
They do. Institutions were founded or seriously beefed up to handle the massive influx of business and funds. New local and foreign banks set up, with specific rules like 65% Kuwaiti ownership, significant capital requirements, branches expanded, services improved, investment funds were actively marketed, a real financial rebuild.
And the pace of bank formation apparently sped up significantly in 96, 97, driven by optimism about reconstruction.
Yeah, and that optimism fueled this feverish speculation on the stock exchange, especially banking and industrial stocks. Daily trading hit record levels over 50 million Kuwaiti dinars daily in 1997. Investment companies made huge profits.
It didn't last.
No. It peaked in June 97 and then just collapsed. Why? A rapid withdrawal of foreign investors and financial institutions. The sources link it to this pervasive greed-is-good attitude and an overly optimistic belief the property and banking booms would just go on forever.
And this was the second crash.
The second crash of the stock exchange within 7 years, yeah. A significant blow to national morale, as the source puts it.
And the economic troubles didn't start there.
No, in 98, worries arose about the liquidity of some international banks. The stock market crash also burst the real estate bubble, creating this bifurcation, a split in the market by 99. The property sector declined so badly that even informal brokers, hawk agents, struggled to earn commissions, a real downturn.
These traumatic events, the war, the economic shocks, they've clearly shaped how Kuwait navigates modernity now, impacting politics, society, the economy in the 21st century.
Oh, definitely. The immediate effects of the Gulf War really influenced post-2000 Kuwaiti politics. In 91, the government announced a democratic system, but the initial election laws seemed to kind of manage the representation of women and Shia candidates.
And the parliament that followed was brief.
Yeah, lasted only a short time. Political struggles, resentment among grassroots groups towards families who'd left during the occupation. Then in 93, a stated restoration of democracy involved repealing that post-war election law, but promising a return to the original one. That caused friction with parliament, led to protests over cabinet appointments, a messy period.
The sources describe this persistent political tension and maneuvering.
They do. Political groups sometimes aligned in ways that reinforced what the source calls tragic mistakes from the past. Actions by the ruling family included detaining members of the state council, former parliament, exiling others. There were reports of these metaphorical glass ceilings, limiting Shia MPs and independent women in politics. Limited legal elections started again in 96, contested by various alliance parties.
Leadership changes also added to the mix.
Right. A new king crowned in 99. Political unrest seemed to heighten in 2000-2001 allegations of mafia influences. Then the deaths of 3 teenagers in police custody in 2001-02 sparked street protests. Mid-2002, Shia lawmakers reportedly blocked elections. A prominent female figure and her supporters noted as being fully covered in 2004. Then the king died in 2006.
War tension.
Yeah, tensions rose between factions in the royal family over succession. The source mentions the last king's death and succession were contested, alongside these vague mentions of assassinations. A volatile time.
Royal decrees tried to address some issues, though.
3 decrees were issued, yes. One aimed at clarifying the separation of powers between government branches. Another amended the electoral law again. A third changed council memberships and duties. The military reportedly showed new powers through arrests. Rivalry persisted. And the new king was described as having rode back the separation of powers idea, regaining control over the judiciary and state council. Suggests reassertion of executive authority.
And the succession process itself sounds like it was divisive.
Very much so. The source describes it causing some pro-cons, maybe supporters of a particular stance, to surrender, leading many to flee or die outside the country. And it lists notable acts of dissent. 40-day protests, a hunger strike, remote science seminars with citizens abroad, civilian lawsuits, parliament challenging electoral law changes, symbolic requests like for plastic electoral forms, debates among youth groups. It shows the diverse ways political tensions were playing out.
Connecting this political turbulence to broader social changes, the post-war period really brought profound shifts, didn't it?
Absolutely. The last couple of decades have seen huge changes driven by globalization, sparking widespread debates, introducing new values, new ideas. The war and liberation were clearly the most apparent source of this transformation. It deeply impacted the national psyche, created this sense of existential fears.
And for the first time, that experience of occupation, liberation, it made the Kuwaiti context feel identical to the wider Arab experience, highlighting vulnerabilities.
Right. It brought this awareness of threats to social structures, maybe similar to Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union fell. Sovereign power, which had maybe felt secure, was suddenly perceived as flimsy, fragile, subject to outside whims. And this raised what the source calls an anxiogenic question, an anxiety-provoking one, about whether Kuwaiti identity and social structures could actually handle, could mitigate these rapid changes.
And debates just raged across media platforms about the reality being shaped by mass media.
All sorts of things. Should a Kuwaiti woman shake hands with men? Concerns about foreign women and men working together causing jealousy, impacting Kuwaiti women's lives, arguments about minority responsibility for cultural acceptance or rejection, campaigns about the sacredness of freedom, even the distribution of wedding-related services or benefits described as based on ugly criteria, suggesting unfairness. Observations about work relationships in news organizations, too. Concerns about alarming renders, maybe interpretations, related to indices measuring transparency, corruption. The source notes, small Kuwait was apparently surprised by great international driving laws, while economic setbacks were sometimes seen as beneficial side notes, maybe because they forced needed reforms. These anxieties were often framed as part of broader Middle East existential fears, a view noted as widespread among perceptive people, including elites.
Economically, alongside that post-war recovery, there were also ongoing challenges and attempts at diversification.
Yeah, one figure, President Debussy, was credited with separating commerce from direct government administration. That led to new professional groups emerging in ministries like foreign affairs, finance. Job seekers flocked to Kuwait, especially as unexplained personal fortunes apparently accumulated back in the 1970s.
But the war left this massive debt burden.
Huge debts, yes, resulting from Iraq plundering and misappropriating state funds and private property. Iranian and American actions described as economic warfare reportedly dismantled defenses around liberation time. The exiled cabinet returned to a totally shattered political and economic capital. Reconstruction took nearly 10 years, involved taking on heavy debts from sanctioned sources and from wealthy neighbors like Saudi Arabia, who were also, protecting their own investments.
Oil-aided GDP growth did eventually get back above pre-1990 levels, though.
It did. But political and economic problems lingered. Debussy was impeached for corruption, exiled in November 97. His replacement came too late to ease the social pain of a 1996 privatization austerity program, which apparently caused inflation to soar. Treasury and investment losses were said to be bigger than officially stated. Economic sectors were classified, and the source mentions unprecedented secrecy and exclusive privileges were granted to the princely family. Cash was also reportedly poured into aging housing. And those quarrels among Bahrain banks get mentioned again in this later period, suggesting continued regional financial instability.
This complex internal situation, it clearly influences Kuwait's foreign relations, its role in what can be a pretty volatile region.
No doubt. Kuwait has pursued extensive foreign policy with Arab states since independence, right through the 1990s. Relations with Iraq are always central, obviously, but the sources highlight awareness of serious problems. Oil and gas disputes, concerns Iraq was exploiting the situation, lack of reciprocity, Iraqi intervention in Kuwait's internal affairs.
The source even mentions exiled opposition figures hoping Iraq would end the al-Sabah rule and worries about Kuwaiti students in Iraq, fears of pan-Arabism spreading, leading to paranoid speculation back home.
Right. And partly in response to Iraq's aggression, closer relations developed with the other Gulf states. There was also anxiety over unauthorized oil pipeline construction, seen as a potential threat to Kuwait's independence.
Within regional groups like the Council of Arab Economic Unity, Kuwait played a role coordinating aid and financing projects, even one involving Iraq.
Yes, and the sources note Arab states, including Kuwait, voting in regional forums to support Egypt as a developing country, opposing what they saw as big power imperialism and insatiable growth of banking monopoly capital in the Western world, reflects that broader regional view on global economics.
Kuwait's regional position is consistently described as precarious, isn't it?
Absolutely. Surrounded by larger players looking for influence or control, Kuwait's policy is just heavily shaped by its vulnerability, the balance of power. Dependency on external powers was clear during the Cold War. Regional powers are seen as vital for its security.
So its history and the shifting balance really dictate policy.
Yeah. Its survival and prosperity back in the 18th and 19th centuries relied on its geography, its trade policy, and leaning on external support. Later, its regional prominence allowed for a more relatively independent policy focused on nation-building, balancing relations. After independence in '61, they initially tried a non-aligned policy, balancing interests, until the 1980s.
And the Iranian Revolution in 1979 presented new challenges.
Big challenges. A clear desire to curb Iranian expansionism and significant fear the revolution could inspire sentiment among Kuwait's own notable Persian population and citizens estimated around 30%.
Then the 1990 invasion, the '91 Gulf War, it just underscored how indispensable external powers were.
Totally. Coalition forces liberated Kuwait. That trauma had lasting repercussions, contributed to the weakened state of Iraq, while Kuwait emerged as one of the world's richest countries, and subsequently hosted bases for Western powers. The source observes that controlling Kuwait was risky for Iraq, but is seen as essential for Iran, which views Kuwait as part of its strategic depth and apparently has not ruled out an invasion, a constant pressure.
And this external vulnerability is linked to internal feelings about governance.
It seems so. Among Gulf states, Kuwait has reportedly shown the highest dissatisfaction rate with the government's direction, linked to questions about internal political freedoms and the perceived dominance of external factors over its foreign policy. Regional challenges, internal issues, they led to this reassessment of foreign policies back in August 2019.
Okay, moving from politics and security, let's explore culture, education, innovation, areas where the sources highlight really deep roots, but also forward-looking efforts.
Yeah, Kuwait's culture is described as this blend of ancient and contemporary. Rich traditions, arts, crafts, folklore, literature, reflecting a diverse cosmopolitan society.
And poetry holds a particularly important place.
Hugely important, seen as a cultural heritage uniting society since ancient times. Recitation is common. Oral narratives, traditional songs teach values. Even the sailor's song gets sung at celebrations. Poets compete for patronage. Women gather for coffee chats, involving these verbal games that promote cognitive and social skills. It's deeply embedded.
Coastal songs mimicking the sea are mentioned too, symbolizing deep feelings.
Right. And traditional coastal dishes, favoring spices and herbs over salted or fried methods, they're still popular. The use of local animal and plant materials for crafts is highlighted too good for biodiversity, strengthens social relationships, cooperation.
And Kuwait's history as a commercial center made it a hub for cultural works brought by different nationalities.
Exactly. A distinct feature of its intangible heritage is apparently maintaining friendly relationships with audiences. Reflects a sense of shared national identity, common needs, tastes. They've preserved gender-specific songs, but also promoted performance evolution, mixing old and new styles.
And this rich poetic heritage actually helps Kuwaitis respond to this rapidly changing world.
That's the argument. Poets use it to narrate past events, analyze current changes through roundtables, TV debates, discussing things like the ideal leader or nation. The definition of poetry has even broadened to include influences from Western films, songs promoting peace. Future uncertainty resonates in their poetry.
Yeah.
And preserving the unwritten cultural heritage is seen as a task of great urgency.
Education is another area of really significant focus in the sources.
Described as having been devoted to knowledge and education since ancient times, the first formal school was 1911, then Arabic and English schools founded by foreign organizations. Higher ed started with Kuwait University in 1963, offering degrees right up to PhD level.
And the government places a really high priority on education, dedicating over 25% of its budget to it.
That's what the source says. It provides high-quality free education from kindergarten through university for citizens. And since 1977, Kuwait has also provided scholarships for foreign students from various countries. Shows that outward-looking approach again.
National plans encourage students towards technical education, work, university studies, with state scholarships for those who excel.
Right. A state technical and vocational school started in the 60s. And now there are numerous private institutions offering diplomas, associate degrees in scientific fields too, a growing sector.
The sources also give some examples of Kuwaiti innovation.
They do. Emerging tech being adopted or developed includes things like PC systems, integrated computing, phone answering systems, self-ordering tech. And specific Kuwaiti innovations mentioned are an ad tracking system, a 3D ROV tracking system for the oil industry, a self-swinging glass system for buildings, a strip breaker device, a blood loss measurement device, a tears measurement device, and a computerized vehicle inspection device. Quite a range.
And the state actively encourages this.
Yes, it grants patent rights and full inventor rights.
Okay, so alongside these positive developments, challenges clearly persist, particularly regarding women's rights.
Yes, the sources definitely highlight that women's rights activists have faced political repression, particularly during those periods of parliamentary tension in the early 2010s, which seemed to create momentum against advancing women's rights.
The dismissal of Parliament in December 2011, the subsequent elections where half the winners apparently had security ties, that seems to have contributed to a climate where anti-women's rights sentiment gained ground.
It seems that way. A coalition whose campaigns specifically targeted women electors reportedly did well in June 2013. And in a parliamentary session discussing a law about women's rights to equal titles dependent on spouses, in July 2013, the discussion apparently started with this lengthy statement arguing against women's rights.
What kind of arguments did this coalition make?
Things like claiming different titles didn't hurt women's financial well-being and arguing that liberation or equal titles would somehow undermine family values. Familiar arguments, perhaps.
The sources give some historical context, too. Voluntary associations led by elite women back in 1920, though they weren't allowed leadership roles. Then the Al-Nada movement in the 50s, elite women pushing for rights with elite male support, inspired by other Arab states.
Right. Though the source notes, rather cryptically, that Al-Nada brought misfortunes to middle and lower-class families. Hard to know exactly what that refers to without more detail, but suggests maybe social disruption or negative consequences from its focus.
The discarding of traditional abayas by educated women returning from abroad is also mentioned.
Yes. And as more women entered employment, laws were apparently passed that limited the scope and duration of their work, suggests a pushback against their increasing workforce participation. Access to higher education was also limited. Initially, few women got university degrees in 1960 because of high school standards back then.
Another significant challenge highlighted is youth employment, even though Kuwait's youth labor force participation rate is relatively high.
Yeah, it's presented as this dilemma. Participation rate is high, over 70%. Youth unemployment rate, 14.5%, is relatively low compared to the wider MENA region.
Yeah.
But UT, the actual number of unemployed youth is high because there's a large youth population, and that's often overlooked.
At a big majority, 60% of those unemployed youth are skilled or educated.
Exactly, which indicates the labor market just struggles to absorb them. The public sector is dominant, but jobs aren't guaranteed. It really highlights the need for more active labor market policies, things to improve how the market works and connect skilled youth to jobs.
Youth employment is also less responsive to economic growth compared to adult employment.
Right, and education levels matter, but there's this paradoxical finding.
Yeah.
Having higher secondary or tertiary education increases your chances of being employed compared to lower levels. Okay. But getting a tertiary degree actually has a negative net effect on employment compared to lower degrees. It suggests many employed youth hold higher qualifications than their jobs actually require. They're overqualified. Points to a real structural mismatch in the labor market.
Okay. On a more positive note, the sources discuss the development of tourism.
Yeah. After independence, there was keen interest in attracting visitors. Buildings completed during those oil industry changes were repurposed or opened up. Efforts were made to improve hotel standards, diversify attractions. Country hotels, motels started popping up in suburbs. The Kuwait Hotel was noted as a fashionable meeting place back then.
Friendly service was observed, even if maybe a bit slow sometimes.
Seems so.
Yeah.
Peak tourist activity was linked to the Hajj pilgrimage. And the reasons given for increased activity included liberation from trusteeship and just actively wanting to welcome tourists. Early 60s, Kuwait joined an international travel club, made real efforts to woo back foreign visitors.
And new attractions were developed to broaden the appeal.
Things like a new amusement park, a natural history museum focused on Arabian fauna, new manned submarines for dives, starting construction on a museum of Islamic art and ethnography. Expat shopping malls grew in suburbs too, anticipating more demand.
The sources mention increasingly accurate menu cards, signaling a new era for hotels and restaurants.
Yet contrasting smaller, better-run places with older, larger ones described rather colorfully as starting as flags of convenience for foreign dredging companies or as instruments of idiocy for drinks distributors.
Quite the description.
It paints this picture of a hospitality sector evolving, maybe from purely functional or even dubious origins, towards something more professional, more focused on the visitor experience.
In recent years, like everywhere else, Kuwait has faced major crises, leading to this focus on crisis management and resilience.
Absolutely. Global events, politics, disasters, the pandemic, they've fundamentally altered how governments and organizations approach risk and response. Governments upgrading safety, security, organizations reevaluating crisis management, workforce resilience policies.
Organizations worldwide were just forced to innovate, adapt really quickly, build more resilient, flexible, mobile workforces.
And Kuwaitis experienced this directly. Transitioning to working from home during the pandemic, starting March 2020, lasted over 16 months. Lives totally upended, schools online, employees remote, required new tech, new ways of organizing work.
And the Ministry of Health played a key coordinating role.
Yes, its response was tightly coordinated with other authorities. Getting information out, using state-controlled media for updates, regulating false information. Kuwait implemented quarantine measures, made sure medical resources were available.
And the success of how organizations adapted was influenced by key enabling factors.
Right. Kuwaiti organizations learned to adjust. Some adopted more flexible frameworks, others just added new policies onto existing processes. The sources suggest lessons learned, especially from adopting more flexible approaches, will help with planning for future crises.
And while normalcy has largely returned, some changes from that pandemic period seem permanent.
It looks that way. Policies, procedures, practices, tech, even cultures that were introduced or enhanced during the crisis, they're remaining in place, continuing to adjust the workplace, the organizational climate, in lasting ways.
Okay, bringing our deep dive towards its conclusion now, the sources offer this glimpse into Kuwait's vision for the future.
Yeah. As Kuwait celebrated its 60th independence, 30th liberation anniversaries, there's this acknowledgement of the rich history, heritage, successes, achievements, but also this palpable yearning for more across all sectors: government, economy, health, education, culture, a forward look.
And the real wealth, the true drivers of this future vision, are seen as the people of Kuwait themselves.
Right. The role of the Sons of Kuwait in driving changes during the information and tech revolution is highlighted. State strategic visions, development plans, they're framed as explicit attempts to anticipate and cope with the future.
Kuwait is described as being in dire need to prepare for that expected future, set a comprehensive vision for improving both government and non-governmental sectors.
And there's that ambition mentioned, the aspiration to become the best and richest country in the world in the coming years. Though the sources suggest achieving that would need really deep analytical studies across all regions, sectors, with a fixed time frame. It's a huge goal.
Its location contributes to its potential, though.
Definitely. Its location basically makes it a land port for goods and commodities transit. It's also described as blessed with exceptionally qualified manpower, thanks to its education system.
The globalization of finance, banking, investment systems helps capital flow in. Kuwait's noted as having higher monetary reserves than any other nation mentioned in the sources. Its power stations for electricity desalination are cited as cheaper than neighbors.
And these factors, taken together, are expected to consolidate Kuwait's role as what's called an axis of consumer trade.
So what does this all mean, then? We've journeyed from those ancient burial mounds, early trade routes forged by a tough geography, through the rise of maritime power, the shock of invasion, that incredibly rapid modernization fueled by oil, and now these complex dynamics of modern politics, society, the economy.
You've really seen how external forces, geography, undeniably shaped Kuwait, but also how its people, driven by these unique values forged by their environment and history, just repeatedly adapted, innovated, rebuilt.
It's a story of trading acumen, unexpected wealth, navigating powerful regional giants, and this ongoing tension between tradition and rapid global change, from cultural identity to challenges in women's rights and youth employment.
Yeah, the sources make it crystal clear that Kuwait has faced immense challenges, internal struggles too, yet its resilience, its cultural depth, and its ambition for the future are just undeniable.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for you, the listener. Considering Kuwait's deep history of adapting to external influences, navigating internal challenges, and its stated vision for the future, aspiring to be among the best and richest nations while keeping its unique identity in dealing with regional complexities, what do you think will be the single most important factor determining whether it actually achieves that vision in the coming years? Something to mull over long after this deep dive ends.